Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Bag Blogger. So periodically I'm going to be posting video blogs on subjects that I think are pretty interesting and important, and well, like topics like contemporary politics, global affairs, science and history, just kind of to name a few. So what can you expect from the Bag Blogger? Well, brutal honesty for one thing, biting commentary, and maybe a little bit of humor. So some of you might be a little offended, but hey, that's okay, because I think that expressing ideas and opinions are really essential to a democracy. Now some of you guys are probably asking, why the bag? Well, you see, the bag is symbolic. It represents, really, a powerless, sort of faceless member of society. You know, the common man, one of the 99%. I don't represent any particular party, speak on behalf of any organization. The opinions here are mine, but I believe they're shared by many. So in this first episode, I want to talk about the subject that I feel pretty strongly about, and that's, why do countries brag endlessly about the values they stand for, but yet their actions often run contrary to what they profess? So I believe this is because countries often have to choose to follow their perceived interests instead of choosing policies in line with their core ideals. So I also believe when this happens, short-term gains can be realized, but in the long term, choosing policies that don't align with national ideals is always a bad decision. Let me illustrate what I mean by a few examples. Okay, so in 1953, the CIA and the British government orchestrated a coup to remove the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. Incidentally, Time Magazine's Man of the Year. Mohammad Mossadegh was his name, and here is a picture of Iran for those that aren't sure where the country is. Okay, so for years Mossadegh fought against British control and exploitation of Iranian oil. The British were also not too interested in fair contracts like the ones the Americans had actually made with the Saudi Arabian Aramco company. So the British pretty much wanted complete control over Iranian oil, but following the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry and before the coup, the British decided to blockade all Iranian oil, froze Iranian bank accounts, and threatened legal action against anyone who tried to purchase Iranian oil. By the way, this sounds pretty familiar today for those who have been watching the news. So, when that didn't work, they convinced the U.S. government to help get rid of Mossadegh. He was a problem. For the U.S., it seemed like a pretty good idea at the time. Keep the British happy and keep them in NATO, while preventing the overthrow of a government that was feared to turn, or at least be sympathetic, to communism. The ousting of Mossadegh was followed by the reinstatement of the monarchy and the return of Mohammad Pahlavi, which you may know as the Shah of Iran. But he wasn't very popular, and soon the infamous intelligence agency SAVAK resorted to kidnappings and torture and killings to simply retain power and keep the monarchy in place. So the Shah was finally overthrown in 1979 by the Islamic Revolution. He was at the time undergoing cancer treatment in the States, and irate Iranians who were very upset about the U.S. support for the Shah sacked the U.S. embassy, and we all remember, took a whole bunch of hostages. Now, relationships, of course, between the U.S. and Iran have really not been the same ever since. The Iranian example shows what happens when you conspire to oppose ideals you espouse, democracy in this case. The blowback Western countries have had to contend with for decades because of pretty much a bad policy enacted in short-term interests, really has been pretty significant. And instead of dealing with a large democracy, we pretty much have wrestled with how to deal with a resentful and mistrustful theocracy moving towards nuclear arms. And looming conflict today seems pretty closer than it ever has been. Okay, our second example deals with Israel. This is a country essentially founded on the principle of conquest and colonization of foreign territory. Now, this is a modern colonial power, and Israel came into existence when pretty much millions of Jews from Europe, Asia, and the Americas decided to settle in what they claimed was their ancient homeland. Well, the only problem was there were people living there. Well, the Palestinians, although Prime Minister Golda Meir famously denied there was no such thing as the Palestinians, now not letting the rights of indigenous people stop them, the Zionists around the world begin to settle in Palestine first by buying land, then by immigrating illegally, and finally by wresting control of the territory by force of arms. Many wars were fought, ostensibly for security, but in reality always with the intention of conquering more territory. The Six-Day War in '67 was pretty much the defining moment in modern Israeli-Palestinian relations today. Not content with controlling almost 3/4 of Palestine, Israelis quickly moved to seize the rest of it in '67. Almost a half a century later, the West Bank and East Jerusalem remain as occupied territories. Palestinians have endured decades of checkpoints, security clampdowns, collective punishment, torture, and pretty much extreme hardship in what is well understood to be a modern-day apartheid system. Now, Israel has certainly done its utmost to try to colonize the rest of the occupied territories by building settlements frantically, bulldozing Palestinian homes, and erecting walls to permanently annex as much land as possible. Unfortunately for Israel, no country, nor the UN, accepts Israeli sovereignty over territories acquired in the '67 war. Nor is the ownership of land really considered disputed. International law is quite clear. Israel cannot annex East Jerusalem, nor are any of the settlements legal. Countries just are simply not permitted to transfer their populations into territories occupied through warfare. Now, we've endured decades of violence and untold human suffering in the Middle East. The reason for this is quite clear. When basic human rights are violated and the world fails to act, conflict persists. Now, the human desire for freedom is pretty much unquenchable. And in the case of Israel and Palestine, Israel has always had the choice between peace with the Palestinians or Palestinian land. They've sadly chosen land. Now, support for Israel may appear to be in the interest of the U.S. or European countries, but clearly not aligned with the values of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and therefore clearly not a sustainable or good policy. So finally, I'm going to turn to torture. The black mark on mankind. Proof that inhumanity has no bounds. Now, after the deadly attacks of 9/11, the U.S., rightly so, moved to confront Al-Qaeda. No one questions the right of the U.S. to self-defense. However, how the U.S. conducted the campaign has already resulted in serious damage to U.S. credibility. Extraordinary rendition, the denial of the Geneva Convention, rights of prisoners of war, due process of law, and the use of torture really bring back haunting memories of World War II. Clearly, the nation forgot what so many veterans fought for a half a century ago. I encourage you to read the book Time for Outrage by Stéphane Hessel, a veteran from the French resistance, also a former prisoner of war of the Nazis, and a Jew himself. He writes extensively about this topic, and I think you'd enjoy reading the book. At the time, and in anger, the methods used in the war against Al-Qaeda seem to have been in the interests of the country, but clearly against its ideals. Long term, therefore, such a strategy is bound to have negative, serious repercussions. Now, all of the examples that I talked about today in this episode seemed like good ideas at the time. There was political support, they aligned with vested interests, and they may have seemed like prudent things to do. However, because the policies were not consistent with those ideals mankind has come to endorse, well, they just simply will continue to haunt us. But what are the ideals worth promoting? Freedom. The right to associate with those you choose to. The freedom to practice your chosen religion or abstain from one. The freedom of movement and the freedom of speech. These are essential freedoms. Democracy. In other words, rule by the people. A government solely charged with serving the people, not ruling over it. The rights of all citizens to elect their government and to remove it when appropriate. Protection of human rights is another right. This includes equal rights for all men, women, and children, regardless of race, religion, color, sex, and so forth. The right to live in safety without fear. And the abolition of torture, slavery, exploitation, cruel punishment, and the end of the death penalty. Health and education, the right of all to affordable health care and education for all. And the rule of law, the understanding that no one is above the law and all are accountable for their actions. The right to a fair and speedy trial, access to evidence against you, and the right to counsel. So these are some. And here's the test. Whenever a new policy or military action, maybe it's a sanction or an embargo or a diplomatic action is applied, apply the interests or ideals test. If the policy aligns with your values as a person and your nation, then support it and endorse it. If not, it's not worthy of supporting. Long term, it will be a bad policy. So, stand up, be heard, and make your opinions known. Until next time, I'm the Bag Blogger because sometimes just has to be said.